Morning, everyone. Two of my favorite colleagues. Isn't this great? How wonderful to have my Congresswoman, Lisa Blunt Rochester here, one of my great mentors, Susan Collins, who's been my collaborator on so many issues over the years. This is like dying and going to heaven. Could you come back every day? That probably wouldn't work. But anyway, on a serious note, we're happy to be here. We're happy to be here with you and grateful for your service. But I want to call this hearing to order. As you know, we're here today to examine three bills that are intended to improve our nation's antiquated air quality monitoring systems and better protect Americans from air pollution. Since enacting the Clean Air Act, I guess it's been a half century ago now, our nation has made great progress in cleaning up the air that we breathe without harming economic growth. But I like to say everything I do, I know I can do better. And the same is true with respect to the quality of the air that we breathe. Soot and smog pollution in the United States have decreased, listen to this, since 1970 by 80%. We don't oftentimes reflect on the accomplishments we've made and the progress we've made. That's pretty good, 80% reduction since 1970. And over that same period of time, our gross domestic product has grown by 250%. The question is, can we may have cleaner air, cleaner water, and create jobs and economic opportunity? The answer is, I think, clear that we can. The benefits of clean air far outweigh the costs, and it's not hard to understand why. Clean air is good for human health, it's good for our planet, and as it turns out, it's good for our nation's economy. As my colleagues know, and I've already said it once today, I'll say it again, everything I do, I know I can do better. And we can do better still on this front, too. Despite our successes, we still have far too many people in this country who are negatively impacted by the quality of their air that they breathe, and especially those from low-income and historically disadvantaged communities. According to the EPA, non-white children are much more likely to die from air pollution than white children in the United States today. Why are environmental justice communities at risk? One answer is proximity. More often than not, those in our nation's environmental justice communities live near or downwind of facilities that emit harmful air pollution. These, we call them fence line communities. These fence line communities, as they are known, bear the immediate impacts of exposure to harmful pollutants and the burdens of the cumulative health effects that can arise from repeated long-term exposure to air pollution. But you don't have to live near a source of air pollution to suffer its consequences. When emitted into the air, persistent air toxics like mercury can fall into our waterways and bioaccumulate in fish over decades, long after a source may clean up or close down. Many Americans today do not even know that they are being exposed by, bless you. Record showed two blessings. Three. We only do three. That's it.
Three to my max.
That's a max. We'll make an exception. But many Americans today do not even know that they are being exposed to dangerous levels of air pollution. There are real gaps in what the federal government knows as well. Today, the Government Accountability Office, which we affectionately call GAO will testify in its troubling 2020 study on the state of our nation's air monitoring systems. Their report found that our air monitoring systems are woefully out of date and under-resourced. According to GAO's findings, these out-of-date systems have left the state of our air quality managers buying replacement parts on eBay. And why do they do that? They do that because the air monitoring for technology that states are using today is no longer being manufactured. We continue to rely on yesterday's systems to address today's problems. GAO also found that what we've long known, and that is while health threats posed by air toxics are well documented, the data we have on where, when, and how they are released into our air are not well documented. And that's just not acceptable. We can and we must do more to support federal, state, and local officials who are tasked with maintaining and improving our air monitoring systems. Now that brings us to the legislation that we're considering here today. For more than a decade now, I've had the privilege of working alongside Senator Collins on a bunch of issues, but in particular on the one that's before us today, and that's Comprehensive National Mercury Monitoring Act. She's been a leader on this for more than a dozen years. We're grateful for that. I'm grateful for her letting me be her wingman on this issue and others. But mercury is a powerful neurotoxin that is especially dangerous to pregnant women and developing children. An estimated 100,000 to 200,000 children born in our country each year are exposed to levels of mercury in the womb that are high enough to impair neurological development. Congresswoman Rochester, I don't know exactly how many children we have in Delaware under the age of 18, but we probably don't have that. We probably have about 200,000. About 200,000. So just how many is 200,000? Every child in our state. That's really what it's comparable to. In the last decade, we've known that there have been more mercury consumption fish advisories in U.S. lakes and rivers than all other pollutants combined. However, we still have data gaps on where mercury persists in our environment. Our legislation fills in the gaps by establishing a first-ever national mercury monitoring network to track long-term trends in mercury concentrations in communities and ecosystems across our country. Under our legislation, the public would have free access to the network's findings, empowering communities with the information that they need to better protect themselves from mercury pollution. And I'm grateful that my partner in this effort, Senator Collins, is joining us today to speak further on this legislation which she leads. We'll also examine Senator Duckworth and Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester's legislation, Public Health Air Quality Act, of which I'm also a co-sponsor. This legislation would upgrade and expand our nation's outdated air monitoring networks, which includes providing immediate monitoring for air toxics in fence-line communities experiencing high cancer rates and other health impacts. And finally, we'll review the Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act, sponsored by Senator Markey, a member of this committee. His legislation would help ensure that communities have access to relevant, local air quality information. Our current air monitoring systems do not always provide accurate, localized data, which makes it harder for communities to assess their exposure to certain toxics. All three bills are intended to help Americans understand who is being exposed to air pollutants and who is not. These investments in our air quality monitoring systems are investments in healthier communities and a stronger economy. And where I come from, that is a win-win situation. We look forward to hearing more from our colleagues and our witnesses on the benefits of these important pieces of legislation. Before we do, please return to our ranking member, Senator Capito, for her opening statement. Senator Capito, please.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, and welcome to Representative Rochester and Senator Collins, my friend. And we're happy to have all the witnesses joining us here today. As we consider the topic of air quality monitoring today, it's important, as Senator Carper began his statement, just how much air pollution in the United States has fallen in the past few decades. With environmental issues, sometimes there's a tendency to just fixate on the negative. But I'm an optimist and believe, while there is always room for improvement, we need to recognize and applaud what the U.S. has accomplished. Looking forward, we must also bear in mind that costs rise and benefits diminish as emission targets approach the limits of what our technology can actually measure and mitigate. According to the EPA data, between 1970 and 2021, the combined emissions of particulate material, carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and volatile organic compounds were reduced by 78%. From 1990 to 2017, emissions of hazardous air pollutants declined by 74%. On top of that, U.S. greenhouse emissions, gas emissions have also decreased, thanks primarily to the shale revolution and American ingenuity, not our regulatory policies. While our emissions have been decreasing, this has not been the case around the world. According to the World Air Quality Report for 2021, using particulate matter as a proxy for air quality, Central and South Asia are home to 46 of the world's most polluted cities, and the trends there are dire. Given the fact that we are seeing continual air quality improvements under current authorities in the U.S., it's unclear to me why the EPA needs new air quality authorities. I especially question granting EPA new powers given the agency's reaction to last month's decision by the Supreme Court in West Virginia versus the EPA. That decision should have been a clear signal to the EPA that its planned regulatory overreach needs to be reined in. But the administration's immediate reaction to the West Virginia decision has been quite the opposite, doubling down on plans to serve the interests of progressive environmental groups and the trial bar, no matter what the law says, what the costs are to society, or even if there are meaningful environmental benefits as a result. As Administrator Regan said following the decision, quote, "We're going to continue to use every tool in our toolbox because it is under our legal authority, and it's our obligation to protect communities, reduce pollution that is driving climate change, provide certainty and transparency for the energy sector to grow the clean energy economy," end quote. EPA clearly wants to force wholesale changes on our economy based on overly expansive readings of existing law, regardless of what the Supreme Court has said. This mission means reducing affordable, reliable sources of baseload energy generation and slamming manufacturing with an onslaught of new regulation. If EPA is going to continue to read existing statutes well beyond Congress's intent and pursue regulations beyond the scope of the law, only to continue losing in court, then I have concerns about giving EPA new authorities to abuse, much less delegate those supposed authorities to ideologically favored advocacy groups to feed fundraising drives and frivolous lawsuits. For example, EPA stated in its proposed methane rule that the agency plans to allow third-party monitoring in an upcoming supplemental proposal. Congress never intended to empower environmental groups to use taxpayers' dollars to purchase and use potentially unreliable monitoring equipment with no oversight and report that data back to the agency. And then they have that data, which they use to empower the trial bar to pursue their sue and settle lawsuits. Congress provides funding for air quality management activities, including air quality monitoring, through the annual appropriations process. EPA typically receives that funding through state and tribal assistant grants under two primary authorities, Section 103 and Section 105 of the Clean Air Act. EPA provides that funding to states and local air agencies, which in turn they decide where and how to spend their funding on a range of air quality management activities. While the GAO did provide suggestions for EPA to improve implementation in a 2020 report, improvements in implementation of existing authority are not the same as granting new authorities. Indeed, if GAO has concerns about implementation of existing authorities, it begs the question what problem adding new authorities would actually solve. I'm interested in hearing from our witnesses their views on these questions and how monitoring is actually conducted in the field under existing law, as they react to the legislative proposals before them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Capito. And we're now being joined by Senator Markey. He's just settling into his seat, and just 2 days after his birthday. And I sent him a text message, and I said the president, Senator Capito, president hosted, as you know, the annual congressional picnic yesterday, and somehow they didn't put it on Eddie's birthday. It's like a day late, and so we're not today. We're 2 days late. We're having this hearing to honor your birthday. And as Eddie knows, and Lisa and others know, and Senator Capito and Senator Collins know, I always love to call my colleagues on their birthdays if I don't see them. And if I don't reach them, I send them a text message or whatever. And so we hope we had a great birthday. And we're delighted to be here today to listen to hear your comments, please, on the legislation that you have proposed. I think it's called the Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act. And we're pleased today to be examining it today. And Senator Markey, you're recognized for your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for your birthday wishes.
I think one of the people I love to call, we got three or four senators are like 88 or 89. And I called Chuck Grassley when he turned 88. And to call him, he was in Iowa, and I called him to wish him a happy birthday. And I said to him, Chuck, God, you're amazing. And I think he just announced he's running for re-election, I think. And I said, I I don't think I'm going to be running for re-election when I'm 88. I said, I just hope I know who I am and where I am. And he said, I hope you do too.
You know, Satchel Paige, the great
Oh, yes.
baseball player, when asked how could he still be pitching in the major leagues when he was 48 years old, he said, well, let me ask you this question, he said. If you didn't know how old you were, how old would you be? Okay, and that's a good question, you know? And so for me, and I think for you as well, that I think around, I'm still 40 years old, okay? And because I don't really know how old I am unless people call me to remind me on my birthday. But other than that, every day, including this hearing, 40 years old. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. When it comes to federal efforts to improve air quality in the United States, we must first acknowledge the deep-rooted injustices of air pollution in communities across our country. Black, brown, and low-income families are historically more likely to be located near pollution sources. As a result, they have been overburdened by the dirtiest air, yet they have not been given enough federal support to address it or even understand the risks. Some pilot studies have found that concentrations of air pollutants can vary by as much as 800% between one block and another. That exposure makes a big difference for people as they go through their daily lives, and that knowledge could make a big difference as we try to help limit public health challenges. I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record 3 articles about this block-by-block disparity and the correlation between race and redlining of neighborhoods on air quality.
Yeah, without objection. Let me also use this as an opportunity to ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record a Congressional Research Service report released on July 12, 2022 on the West Virginia versus EPA decision, which states, and I quote, under that decision, EPA retains the ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from power plants and other sources, close quote. Without objection. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Formerly red-line communities experience as much as double the amount of air pollution as non-red-line communities, and race plays a big role, even within the same communities. We can't accept that, and we have to do a better job understanding it. We can't properly manage what we don't measure. This is why I partnered with health experts and advocates, including the Clean Air Task Force and We Act, who are represented by some of our esteemed witnesses here with us today, to write and to introduce the Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act of 2021, which is co-sponsored by several members of this committee, including Senators Padilla and Sanders and Duckworth. This legislation would authorize $100 million annually to establish a 5-year pilot program for hyper-local air quality monitoring projects in environmental justice communities. Under this program, state, local, and tribal air agencies would be able to partner with local nonprofit organizations or air quality data providers to identify block-level hotspots for multiple pollutants, increase community engagement, inform air pollution management decisions, and recommend action for reducing pollution burdens in identified hotspots. While our current network of traditional monitors is sparse and often misses areas of poor air quality, hyperlocal air quality monitors can better detect air pollution in the specific areas in which people live and work and go about their daily lives. When it comes to approaches to improve air quality, one size does not fit all from block to block all across our country. With more air quality monitors to capture hyperlocal data and better informed ways to cut down pollution exposure in hotspots, we can make sure that healthy air is no longer determined by zip code. And I would also like to submit a statement of support from House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis Chair, Kathy Castor, who introduced the Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act in the House of Representatives, along with the support and statements from stakeholders. And I want to thank Chairman Carper and Ranking.
Without objection.
I would like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Capito for including my Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act of 2021 in today's hearing, and I look forward to hearing from the witnesses. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Before we turn to Senator Duckworth, who I think is going to join us remotely to make a statement about her legislation, the Public Health Air Quality Act, one last word from Satchel Paige. Not only did Satchel Paige break into he broke into the majors in his early 40s, as Senator Markey has said. He used to, when he pitched in the Negro Leagues, he was so good that when he would take the mound, his infield, he'd call his infielders to tell him to sit down. They'd sit down on the outfield grass. He would strike out the team. Like game after game, week after week, he was that good. He broke into the majors in his early 40s and made the All-Star team, pitched for another half dozen years or so. And Eddie gave him the beginning of the quote about how old you are. He also said that the rest of that quote goes something like this: work like you don't need the money. Dance like nobody's looking. Love like you've never been hurt. Live each day like it's your last. And someday you'll be right. Satchel Paige. And with that introduction, here's a senator who needs no introduction, Senator Tammy Duckworth. Senator, it was great to be with you and your kids last night at the picnic. And you recognized, speak about your legislation, the Public Health Air Quality Act, and I'm proud to be one of your co-sponsors. You recognize this. Please proceed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. That was a great quote, and it was great to see everybody at the White House yesterday. Thank you also to Ranking Member Capito for holding this important hearing to examine important legislative proposals to improve air quality monitoring, including the Public Health Air Quality Monitoring Act of 2022. I was very proud to partner with Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester in developing our legislation, and I'm very pleased that the Congresswoman is testifying this morning as the author of the House version of our bill. Protecting our nation's public health requires achieving clean air for all Americans, yet our current air monitoring system is woefully deficient, both in terms of capacity and capability. This is simply unacceptable status quo. It inflicts devastating and disproportionate harm on low-income communities and communities of color that suffer from higher rates of cancer, asthma, and other diseases just because of where they happen to live. It's outrageous that in the wealthiest country in the world, communities of color are exposed to 63% more air pollution than they create. Last month, I had the opportunity to tour Outgill Gardens, a public housing community just outside of Chicago that is known as the birthplace of environmental justice. Their community leader and activist, Cheryl Johnson, explained the environmental justice challenges her community faces and finished the tour by showing me the Outgill Gardens Cancer Memorial Wall. On the wall, one can see name after name after name of community members who have fallen to cancer and respiratory illnesses resulting from the cumulative impacts of a variety of sources, creating poor air quality that has plagued the area for decades. This harrowing physical representation of the devastating effects of cumulative air pollution should inspire us all to act. No community should have a wall of fallen mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers because they were denied one of the most fundamental human rights, clean air to breathe. That's why this committee must swiftly advance the Public Health Air Quality Monitoring Act and other air quality monitoring legislation. Our bill doesn't seek to reinvent the wheel. Instead, we propose building upon the existing monitoring framework to require EPA to implement immediate fence line monitoring for toxic air pollutants at facilities contributing to high local cancer rates and other health threats from dangerous pollutants. This increased mapping will help support local communities on further actions to confront air pollution, better inform local governments and agencies on permit decisions, and illustrate where federal investments will have the largest benefits to health and equity. By increasing our air monitoring network, updating our existing regulations and methods, and improving our data collection and public engagements, we can help to close the gaping holes in our air monitoring systems. Advancing my Public Health Air Quality Monitoring Act is an important first step towards clean air for all, and I look forward to today's discussion. I also want to thank the chairman for helping me introduce this bill as an original co-sponsor, along with Senators Durbin, Booker, Markey, and Warren. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. And now it's time to hear from our first panel of witnesses. We're fortunate to have Senator Collins with us today. And she is, I said earlier, the lead sponsor of the third and final piece of legislation we're examining today, the Comprehensive National Mercury Monitoring Act. And grateful to have co-sponsored to work with you on this legislation, so many other bills in the past. And you're recognized and warmly welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Capito, I want to begin by thanking you for holding today's hearing and also say what a pleasure it is to share the witness table with my friend from the House, Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester. It's great to have you over on the Senate side. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the Comprehensive National Mercury Monitoring Act, which I have introduced with the distinguished chairman. Chairman Carper mentioned in his opening comments that this is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Air Act, and it is a point of pride for me that that landmark law was authored by Maine Senator Edmund Muskie. And earlier this summer, I participated in an event in Senator Muskie's hometown of Rumford with his son, Ned Muskie, where we commemorated the 50th anniversary of the Clean Air Act.
Boy, it doesn't get much better than that.
It doesn't. And so your hearing is particularly timely. Our bipartisan mercury monitoring bill would help ensure that we have accurate, scientifically based data about mercury pollution in our country. As this committee well knows, mercury is a potent neurotoxin. Exposure can lead to significant health problems, especially in children and pregnant women. Mercury exposure has gone down as U.S. mercury emissions have declined. However, levels remain unacceptably high, and in some cases, we really don't know how much mercury is in our environment. In Maine, some of our lands and bodies of water face higher mercury pollution compared to the national average. That's because of Maine's location. It's sometimes called the tailpipe of the nation.
Yeah, but Delaware, as Lisa knows, Delaware is oftentimes, we refer to us as the tailpipe, right at the tailpipe, just like you.
And it's the same concept that the winds from the west are blowing pollution into the pristine air of my beautiful state. A system for collecting information such as we have already for acid rain and other pollution does not currently exist for mercury despite its dangers. A comprehensive national mercury monitoring network is needed to protect human health, safeguard our fisheries, and track the effect of reduced emissions. This monitoring network would also help policymakers, scientists, and the public better understand the sources, consequences, and trends in mercury pollution. Specifically, our legislation would do the following. First, it would direct the EPA in conjunction with other agencies to establish a national mercury monitoring program to measure and monitor levels in the air and watersheds, water and soil chemistry, and in marine, freshwater, and land organisms at multiple sites across our country. Second, it would establish a scientific advisory panel to make recommendations for the establishment, site selection, measurement, recording protocols, and operations of the monitoring program. Third, our bill would establish a centralized database for existing and newly collected environmental mercury data that could be accessed easily on the internet. These data would be compatible with similar international efforts. Fourth, the reporting requirements in our bill will help Congress assess the mercury pollution reduction levels that are needed in order to help prevent adverse human and ecological effects. And finally, our bill would authorize a modest $95 million over 3 years to carry out these important activities. A robust national mercury monitoring network is needed to provide the data to help Congress and others make informed decisions to protect the people of our nation. I would ask unanimous consent that 2 endorsement letters, one from the American Lung Association and another from the American Geophysical Union, be entered into the hearing record, which further explain the need for this legislation.
Without objection.
The chairman mentioned that he and I have worked together to try to get up this monitoring system so that we have accurate data nationwide for many years. I hope that this can be the year where we finally enact it into law. I hope the committee will favorably report our bill for consideration by the full Senate, and I thank you both for the opportunity to testify before the committee today. Thank you.
Thank you. From your lips to God's ears. There you go. Thanks so much for joining us today. I know you got a lot on your schedule this morning, and feel free to leave us when you need to go. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us, for your testimony, and for your leadership for so long on this issue, and so many other issues. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
You bet. All right, now it's a special privilege to introduce a woman who's not only served as cabinet secretary and administration-wise privileged to be governor, but in the subsequent governor as well. She's led several major departments in the state of Delaware for many, many years. First, not only the first African-American to serve as Congress in the House of Representatives from Delaware, first woman to be elected and to serve in the House of Representatives from Delaware, and someone that we're just extremely proud of and have great respect and affection for. Thank you for coming to our committee today to discuss your legislation with us, and you may proceed with your statement at this time. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito and members of the committee and also our fellow witnesses. A special thank you. It was good to be also with Senator Collins, who was one of the great supporters of me in my freshman term. But thank you, Senator, for all of your years of service as well for Delaware and our nation. And I want to start by thanking you and the ranking member for calling this important hearing today and giving me the opportunity to speak about the need to protect the health and well-being of all Americans by expanding our air quality monitoring system. I also want to thank Senator Duckworth for her leadership and partnership on this important issue. Living with a time bomb. That was the headline emblazoned across the front page of Delaware's largest newspaper, the News Journal, earlier this year. The story underneath the headline went on to describe the fear and anxiety that residents of Newcastle County's Route 9 corridor feel every day as they live in the shadow of chemical and industrial plants. Communities such as Newport, Belvedere, and Southbridge have lived with this reality, with this time bomb, for decades, and suffer from higher cancer rates and respiratory hazards as a result. This is an issue of health, education, but more importantly, justice, both environmental and racial. The justice cannot come as an afterthought, and it has to be at the center of our response. We know that decades of discrimination and environmental racism have resulted in disproportionate numbers of communities of color at the front lines, where they risk significant disparities in health outcomes. These disparities are then passed on from generation to generation. It's past time we break the cycle. Communities like the ones I described in Newcastle County aren't an anomaly. Communities across the country that neighbor industrial and chemical facilities are more likely to suffer from higher rates of cancer and respiratory disease. In these communities, it is often the most vulnerable, including children and the elderly, that suffer the most from air pollution health emergencies. For example, exposure to toxic pollutants during a child's development phase has been shown to cause lifelong health and education problems. and ongoing exposure to toxic pollutants may cause premature death in the elderly population, often due to existing comorbidities. We need to work together to address these health disparities and the impacts. Our first step in protecting these communities is to use our air quality monitors in each neighborhood to identify the pollutants of greatest concern. We cannot address the issue without addressing the problem, which is why we need to have a more robust air monitoring system across the country. That is why today I am proud to join Senator Duckworth and other House and Senate environmental justice leaders in reintroducing the Public Health Air Quality Act, and why I'm also proud to partner with Representatives Castor and Torres and Senator Markey on the Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act. The Public Health Air Quality Monitoring Act will better inform and protect communities by requiring EPA to enhance and expand its air quality monitoring network, and will ensure that EPA has the resources they need to do it well. And beyond collecting the data, this legislation will help the community access and understand the data. All too often, the communities that live closest to polluting facilities are the last to find out what toxic pollutants are in their air and how these toxic pollutants impact their health. With the Public Health Air Quality Act, they'll be one of the first to know. From enhancing air monitoring systems at the highest polluting facilities to supporting pilot programs for hyperlocal air monitoring projects in under-resourced communities and communities of color, we need to work together to expand our environmental protection infrastructure. Too many communities throughout our country are living with that time bomb, wondering when or if their government will be there to protect their health. Well, today, let's come together to say that we are here to give them the protection they deserve. We are here to hold polluters accountable and here to make our communities safer and healthier. Healthcare costs are impacted, education costs are impacted, but the ultimate cost is the cost of life. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to working with the Senate to pass these important pieces of legislation. And I yield back.
We look forward to it as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. I understand the House is not doing anything today, so you can stay with us for the whole hearing. But if that's not true, feel free to leave when you got to go.
so
Great
much,
to see you.
Senator.
Thanks for your leadership.
Thank you so
on this and so many other issues. Well, and see you soon. It was a great pleasure to be with your mom and dad yesterday at the White House, along with your sister.
Thank you so much. And I also have to join in your conversation about birthdays and say that I broke into Congress at the mid-50s, and I'm happy this year to turn 60. So I'm proud of that 6 year. Thanks, and thanks for all the happy birthdays over the past 30 years.
You keep having them, I'll keep calling. Okay. All right, I now get to call the witnesses, or the witness for our second panel. And as Congresswoman Rochester leaves, our next witness is Alfredo Gomez. So I'm going to go ahead and give a brief introduction. Mr. Gomez, welcome. I got to say hello to you before we started. It's nice you're good to come and join us today. Alfredo Gomez is the Director for Natural Resources and Environment at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, or GAO. I just spoke with Gene Dodaro yesterday, the Comptroller General, which is always a pleasure. You were, I understand, a leader on GAO's recent comprehensive study on the state of our nation's air quality monitoring system. Mr. Gomez, we welcome you. Thank you for being here today to discuss your agency's important findings, and you may begin your statement at this time. Welcome. Thank you.
So Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I hope that GAO's work helps inform the committee as it considers legislation related to air quality monitoring. Mr. Chairman, as you noted, while the U.S. has made significant progress in reducing air pollution levels since the 1970s, air pollution continues to harm public health and the environment in certain locations. Concerns remain about the health effects of air toxics and wildfire smoke and concentrations of air pollutants in local areas. The air quality monitoring system includes thousands of monitoring sites across the country that measure specific air pollutants. The EPA is responsible for ensuring that this system produces information that's needed to manage air quality. EPA sets the requirements for the system's design, and state and local agencies are the ones that operate the majority of monitoring sites, ensure that data are accurate, and report the data to EPA and the public. EPA, state, and local agencies provide funding for the system. I would like to focus today on two areas covered in our 2020 Air Quality Monitoring Report. The first is the need for additional air quality monitoring information, and the second is challenges that EPA and selected states and local agencies face in meeting these needs. Regarding information, in November 2020, we reported that more information was needed in several areas. The first is the need for information about local scale air quality in real time. This information would help identify air pollution hotspots and provide insights into air quality in rural areas. The second is the need for information about the concentrations of air toxics in key areas. This information would help EPA and others understand hotspots like cancer clusters. It could also help promote environmental justice by highlighting where pollutants are concentrated. The third is information about the quality and performance of low-cost sensors. While low-cost sensors are increasingly available to measure air quality and offer much promise, some officials express concerns about the quality of the data they produce. Having this information could help give insights about the reliability and accepted uses of low-cost sensors. Moving now to the topic of challenges that EPA and states face in providing this information. The challenges include establishing priorities for air toxics monitoring, developing and improving air quality monitoring methods, integrating emerging technologies such as low-cost sensors, and managing and integrating additional monitoring data. EPA, state, and local officials told us that they have incomplete information about the public health risk associated with air toxics, making it difficult to understand which present the highest risks and should be priorities for monitoring. With regard to challenges with air quality monitoring methods, some existing methods were not sufficiently cost-effective, timely, or sensitive, meaning that they did not detect pollution at low enough levels needed to understand health effects. With the third challenge of integrating emerging technologies, EPA has worked with state and local agencies to study low-cost sensors, but performance issues with low-cost sensor measurements have persisted. While EPA has strategies aimed at better meeting needs for additional information on air quality, we found that these strategies were outdated and incomplete. For example, these strategies did not reflect needs for additional information or changes in the agency's approaches and resources. To address these challenges, we recommended that 1, EPA develop and implement an asset management framework so that limited resources are directed towards the highest priorities, and 2, to develop an air quality monitoring modernization plan that aligns with leading practices. Such a plan can help EPA provide information needed to understand and address changing air quality issues, such as wildfire smoke and air toxics, and to make better use of new technologies. EPA agreed with our recommendations and has begun implementing them. Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito, members of the committee, this completes my statement, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. Thanks so much for doing that. From time to time, I say to my staff, when we're dealing with a particular issue or challenge, I say, ask them to help make me or a committee or the Senate guided missile as opposed to an unguided missile. And what I think I read and listen to your testimony and in preparing for this hearing, my sense is that what you're trying to do, what GAO is trying to do here is help make us a guided missile as we face what is a real challenge, but an opportunity as well. As I mentioned in my opening statement, GAO found that some of the air monitoring technology in use in our country is so outdated that air officials have to resort to eBay to purchase equipment because the manufacturer has discontinued the needed parts. I'm struck, in fact, I'm disappointed by this story and what it tells us about the state of air quality monitoring systems. And I think my colleagues ought to be as well. Here's my question, are you able to tell us more about this story or share with us any other anecdotes that you and your team heard directly from air agency officials? Was this a unique incident, or does this story reflect a pattern and the challenges of our air agencies across the country that they're facing?
Thank you for that question, Chairman Carper. And yes, so this is an aging infrastructure, as we've been talking about. And those were the stories that we've heard. We've heard other stories where the air conditioning, for example, failed. There were leaky roofs. One of the states told us how they had to throw away a whole week's of data because the air conditioning wasn't working, and it affected the measurements that they were collecting. So that is one of the challenges that we heard across the board from state and local air quality monitoring agencies. It's just an old system that needs to be updated, which is consistent with our recommendation, as why we told the EPA, you really need to modernize the system, figure out what you need, what the resources are, and put that into place. And really to partner, right, with the state and local agencies who are really the ones operating the system.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Second question, GAO's report found that federal funding for state and for local air monitoring programs has declined by about 20% over the last 16 years, adjusted for inflation. At the same time, air agencies at the federal, at the state, and the local levels are facing rising costs associated with maintaining aging, inefficient infrastructure, purchasing new, more expensive equipment, and staffing needs. Given the dire financial situation many air monitoring programs find themselves in, it appears that additional federal funding might help may well help to alleviate much, not all, but much of the strain that these agencies are facing. Would additional funding for updating our nation's air quality monitoring systems help address some of the challenges found in GAO's report?
Right, so that is exactly what we learned when we looked at the funding across the last 15 years, that it had decreased by 20%. We did hear from local and state agencies and from EPA that more resources would help them do the job. And again, I go back to our recommendation, right? It's really up to EPA as they modernize the system to identify what resources they need and come forward to Congress with that.
Okay. My last question deals again with monitoring of air toxics. I believe GAO found APA's strategies for air toxic and local monitoring were, I think this is a correct quote, is outdated and incomplete. I think that's a correct quote. Briefly, based on the GAO report, what are the greatest gaps in how EPA currently monitors for air toxics and local air pollution, and how could Congress help address these gaps?
Sure. So in the areas of air toxics, we did find where there are additional information needs for air toxics in key locations, such as identified cancer clusters and environmental justice areas around industrial facilities. There's also a need for timely information on air toxics. And what I mean by that is currently when you monitor air toxics, the samples are collected in canisters over a 24-hour period. They're sent to the lab. So there's really a lack of information for real time, exactly when do those elevated readings happen, for example. And then there's also information, as I noted in my opening statement, about air toxics at low levels. So currently the methods that we have for analyzing toxic samples, they're not sensitive enough at these low levels to detect and see if, in fact, these things might be causing bad health effects.
All right, thanks so much. Senator Capito.
Thank you, and thank you for coming before the committee, and thank you for your work at GAO. I'd like to go to the two recommendations that you mentioned in your statement. You mentioned for EPA to develop and implement an asset management framework for national ambient air quality monitoring systems, and secondly, for EPA to develop and make public and air quality monitoring modernization plan. You addressed this a little bit. I'm wondering, what has EPA done? Your study came out in two years ago, in the last 2 years to implement your recommendations.
Yes, thank you for that question, Senator Capito. So we do follow up with our recommendations. First of all, EPA agreed with those recommendations.
Right.
They have been meeting and working with their local and state partners. They have plans already in place to develop an asset management framework, which we think would be really useful, as that would allow them to focus their limited resources on the highest priorities. We understand at the upcoming conference that EPA is having next month on air quality monitoring in Pittsburgh, our report and our recommendations are part of the discussion as they partner with state and local folks to figure out the bigger job of a modernization plan. So we are touching base with them and following up. So we're hopeful that those recommendations will be implemented as well.
Yeah, let me ask you a question on the modernization plan. Let me ask first about the funding issue. It was 20% down funding since 2004, adjusted for inflation. Is that real dollars down, or is that? I don't have the figures in front of me. Has the amount gone up? It just hasn't gone up as much to keep with inflation, or how does that?
Sure. So when we did the report in 2020, we looked back 15 years.
Yes.
And so what we found was that for that time period, there was a decrease in funding of 20%. While controlling for inflation. We can also submit for the record the more details about those numbers.
Okay. So I guess what I'm wondering is, why do you think EPA, with knowing that, you cited some of the real physical problems, lack of air conditioning and things of that nature, why do you think they haven't already moved to a modernization where you can have low-cost monitoring, you can reshape? Do you think it's a bureaucracy that's, kind of immovable, or you like to do it the way it's always been and think it's accurate? Are states resisting? Where do you think the real problems are with why they haven't already moved to a modernization plan 10 years ago?
I think it's a variety of issues. So this is an aging infrastructure. It's a fairly complex. There are many different networks. You can look at our statement and our report where there are thousands of monitors across the country. Now, EPA has been working with its local and state partners, especially as they're looking at these low-cost sensors to figure out where they can be deployed, what the particular uses of them could be. We just didn't see an overall plan where they're really focusing on this aging infrastructure and really coming up with ways to modernize it.
Right.
And so, and again, they're supportive, they're moving in that direction, so we're hopeful to see that come about.
Well, yeah, I would hope sooner. You mentioned it, and I just caught what you said in your opening statement. I went back and tried to find it, but I couldn't find it. You said something about an incomplete list as to what is more toxic than. Can you go back to your statement and read that?
So let's see, if it was about air toxics.
Yeah, and you started. I do have quotes on here about an incomplete list.
With air toxics, it was more that EPA needs to better understand the hot spots, like cancer clusters. It could also help promote environmental justice by highlighting where the pollutants are concentrated. So essentially, there's just a need for additional information when it comes to air toxics, like more local scale information about where those hot spots are, and then also the timing information in real time. So
maybe I was thinking what you were saying is that local and state authorities working with the EPA don't have a clear view of what's the most toxic or what the toxicity level of certain things. That's not what you're saying.
No, I mean, there are already 188, I believe, air toxics that have been identified. Right, it's more the measurement of these toxics in particular locations that's needed.
Okay, I heard that wrong, because I thought what you were saying was that the EPA hasn't provided the data to the local and states to say this type of toxin is more critical or should be more monitored more.
So that is one of the challenges of
that was the incomplete
prioritizing
list.
air toxics, right? There's a need for EPA to figure out which air toxics need priority because of a lack of information. So that's why we're saying there's information that's needed so that the agency can begin to prioritize which air toxics they should monitor.
Yeah, it would seem to me that would be a critical responsibility for
Yes.
the EPA, and in my view, should already be pretty apparent with all the science and data that they generate. So thank you very much.
Senator Capito, thanks very much. We've been joined, as you may have noticed, Mr. Gomez, by several of our colleagues. Senator Whitehouse has been able to come and stay for a bit. I think he has to leave very shortly. Senator Ernst from Iowa just joined us, was in and out. We all serve on multiple committees and subcommittees, and for some reason, a lot of them are meeting right now at the same time. So our folks are coming and going. Senator Padilla from California joined us by WebEx for an earlier part of the hearing, including your testimony. And Senator Cardin has joined us and had to leave and go to another meeting that he's scheduled to have at the same time. I'm going to want to do something, since we have an extra minute or two here, that I don't often do, but I want to do it right now. Is there a question that you wish you had been asked by somebody on our committee? Is there a question that you wish you had been asked by somebody on our committee? And what would that question be?
Sure. I mean, I would say, again, there's a lot of information needs for air toxics, as we were just talking about them. Information about air toxics in key locations, more timely information on air toxics, and then also, again, being able to having analysis methods so that you can get measurements for them. But the other question maybe that we haven't talked about as much is about these low-cost sensors, because low-cost sensors are widely available. GAO, as part of our report, purchased some of these low-cost sensors, and we actually deployed them outside the building because we wanted to test them. We
Outside
wanted
this
to
building?
Outside the GAO building, we put our low-cost sensors to see what kind of information we got. This was for PM 2.5.
Okay.
And, you know, this is one of the things that we've reported on, that there is a need for more work in looking at the quality and performance of the sensors, because we had two sensors, different sensors, and they gave us different measurements. So it's a question about what do you do with the data? Do they need to be calibrated? So that is something that EPA, again, is focused on, because low-cost sensors do provide a lot of information, and really they're widely available now. So we need to figure out where we can use them and how we can use them.
All right, good. Thank you. Thank you for asking and answering the same question. That's great. Not every witness gets that opportunity. All right, to our friends at GIO and to your Controller General, our best regards and thanks for all the good work that you and your colleagues do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'm sure we'll have some questions for the records and look forward to your responses. Thank you. All right, our third and final panel for the morning. Let me introduce and welcome four witnesses: Kathy Fallon, the Honorable Jason Isaacs, and Dana Johnson, and Bart Eklund. Thank you all for joining us today and for appearing. Okay. I understand that Kathy Fallon is joining us virtually, and I understand that Dana Johnson is joining us virtually. We have live and in person Jason Isaacs and Bart Eklund, who's named after the Bay Area Rapid Transit Authority. It's a Naval Flight Officer station at Moffett Field, California. I used to occasionally travel on your system, so it's nice to see what you look like in person. All right. Kathy entered by way of introduction. Kathy Fallon, who's joining us remotely, is currently serving as the Director of Land and Climate at Clean Air Task Force in Boston, Massachusetts. Prior to joining Clean Air Task Force, Ms. Fallon was a senior advisor at the Center for Climate, Health, and Global Environment at Harvard, T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Ms. Fallon, you may begin your statement at this time. Thank you for joining us remotely.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Kathy Fallon. I'm Director of Land and Climate at the Clean Air Task Force, which is an environmental organization founded in 1996 to curb air and climate pollution through policy and
Kathy,
technology
where are you
innovation.
today? Where are you today? Where are you doing?
I'm actually sitting in the town of Heartland, Vermont.
All right. Why?
So interestingly, I hail from Maine, and my family is from Rumford, Maine, where
You're
apparently
kidding.
Senator Collins
Oh, that's great. That's great.
celebrated the Clean Air Act.
Small world, small world.
Small
All right,
world,
go right ahead.
indeed.
Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. Clean Air Task Force strongly supports all three bills before the committee today. There's an urgent need to improve air quality monitoring, especially in overburdened and underserved communities, as called for in the Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act and in the Public Health Air Quality Act. My oral testimony today will focus on the Comprehensive National Mercury Monitoring Act. Here are my key takeaways. Mercury poses serious health risks, and millions of Americans are exposed to elevated methylmercury through fish consumption. Remarkable progress has been made in reducing mercury emissions in the US, particularly from power plants, and that's brought the American public major health benefits. Despite this progress, mercury pollution remains a widespread problem, due in part to the long-range transport of mercury emissions from China. Unfortunately, about half of our mercury deposition monitoring sites have closed due to lack of funding, and there's no federally supported long-term mercury monitoring for fish and wildlife and water. So the problem hasn't been solved, and the nature of the problem is changing, and it's more important than ever to establish and fund a national mercury monitoring network. Mercury in the form of methylmercury can lead to lost IQ, impaired motor function, and cardiovascular disease, including risk of stroke and fatal heart attacks at elevated levels. Approximately 200,000 children are born in the US each year exposed to elevated methylmercury at levels that exceed EPA's reference dose. And unfortunately, there's no threshold below which neurodevelopmental impacts don't occur. Most people are exposed to methylmercury through fish consumption. Sensitive populations include the developing fetus, pregnant women, women of childbearing age, and people who consume a lot of fish. This can include people from households with lower incomes and education levels, as well as high-income populations and individuals from several non-white racial and ethnic groups, as detailed in my written testimony. Most of the methylmercury in fish originates from air emissions. Mercury can be, once emitted, can be transported locally or globally, depending on its form. And methylmercury is staggering in its ability to bioaccumulate in food chains. It can reach levels 100 million times higher in fish than levels in water. Unfortunately, mercury is also somewhat of an equal opportunity contaminant. Any watershed anywhere with the right condition, like areas in rural Maine with lots of forest cover and wetlands, can have high mercury levels in fish and wildlife, even if they're far from sources and have relatively low mercury inputs. Remarkable progress has been made in cutting mercury emissions from the US. In fact, coal-fired power plants have cut their mercury emissions by an incredible 90%. Despite this progress, though, the total mercury deposited to the US has shown only modest improvements and may be increasing in some areas, but we don't know for lack of monitoring. And according to the most recent compilation in 2013, fish consumption advisories for mercury still exist in all 50 states. Here are three of the reasons why mercury pollution is still a problem. Global emissions, particularly emissions from China, have increased, offsetting the benefits of emissions reductions here at home. Climate change is making the problem worse. Mercury is being released from thawing permafrost and by more frequent wildfires, and it's bioaccumulating to higher levels as waters warm. And third, there are sensitive watersheds across the US where even a small amount of mercury can have a large impact. Mercury monitoring today is pieced together with annual funding from various sources. Funding levels have fluctuated over time, and we've lost about half of our mercury deposition monitoring sites so that we can no longer even produce a map of deposition for the whole country. There are large gaps in Western states and in Gulf states. Also, even though fish consumption is the dominant pathway of human exposure, there's no coordinated national long-term mercury monitoring for fish and water. To wrap up, given the hazardous nature of mercury pollution, it's wonderful that we've made so much progress here in the US, but the problem hasn't been solved and the nature of the problem is changing. So it's more important than ever to establish and fund a national mercury monitoring so that the American public can know where it's a problem and where it's not, and can make informed choices about mercury exposure and their health, so that environmental managers can determine whether to delist water bodies that may no longer be impaired by mercury, or to list new ones that now are, and so that policymakers have the data needed to understand how the American public is being impacted by mercury emissions that originate from outside our borders. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you so much. We look forward to asking some questions in just a few minutes. But first, we want to welcome Mr. Isaac, and who's currently serving, as I understand, as the director of Life Powered, National Initiatives of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Do you live in Texas? Yes. Where?
Just outside of Austin.
All right.
In the Hill Country.
All right. Welcome back to our committee, Mr. Isaac. We've, I think, seen you here before.
Yes, great to be
and
back.
we're happy you're back, and you're recognized and welcome to proceed with your statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman and members. I'm Jason Isaac, the Director of Life Powered, a national initiative of the Texas Public Policy Foundation to raise America's energy IQ. From 2011 to 2019, I served in the Texas House of Representatives, and during my freshman session, carried the Texas Emission Reduction Plan legislation. I was the House sponsor for the ozone standards set by the EPA under the Clean Air Act. It's our state.
How often were you in the state legislature?
I was 8 years.
Okay.
Yes, 4 terms. That was our SIP that I carried, the state implementation plan. The EPA's National Emissions Inventory finds that mercury emissions from stationary sources in the U.S. fell 85% from 1990 to 2017, over 200 tons annually to about 30 tons annually. According to a 2018 UN study, 80% of the mercury deposited in North America comes from other continents, with half coming from Asia. A mercury deposition network already exists at the University of Wisconsin. The network consists of approximately 100 stations across the country and is supported by state, federal, and private funding. The Mercury Air Toxics Rule, which cost billions of dollars and resulted in the closure of many coal plants, increased electricity prices and reduced grid reliability in many areas. It was estimated originally by the EPA that there would be $90 billion in health benefits, but resulted in only $6 million in health benefits from reducing mercury emissions. Instead of repeating the narrative that we are dirty and setting impossible emission reduction goals for ourselves, we need to recognize our success, which you both have touted in our clean air here in the United States. We need to get the rest of the world to align with our air quality standards that improve human health. Until we do, our nation will continue to export jobs and import pollution. Regarding environmental justice, the real injustice, Americans' lack of access to affordable and reliable energy. This year, Americans will pay $5,200 more than last year to cover rising prices of gas, electricity, and everyday items. Even before the current energy crisis that Americans are facing, a lawsuit was filed in California that specifically addressed the issue. The plaintiff, more than 200 civil rights organizations, accuses the California Air Resources Board of being racially biased in its environmental regulations and environmental lobby organization. The evidence they present for this case is that the regulations they created primarily hurt minorities, while not doing anything to help the environment in California. The effects of clean energy policies have been catastrophic, as are the measures being taken by the federal government that ignore the science behind air quality and responsible energy practices. When it comes to air quality, we are a world leader. We have reduced the 6 criteria pollutants that the EPA has the authority to regulate under the Clean Air Act by 78% in the past 5 decades, which both of you have touted. The message in the bill is clear. Environmental extremists want to say that the air in these communities is racist and unfair, but what matters more to Americans is not having to choose between food and electricity. The last bill on public health air quality refuses to acknowledge the monumental wins I've already mentioned, as well as the fact that we have the cleanest air of any country with over 50 million people. We should be celebrating our success, not spending more money to spread unnecessary climate alarmism. If we want to improve the lives of all Americans, then we should do so with our affordable, reliable energy from fossil fuels. Until the EPA demonstrates that it will end its war on American energy, Congress should not bless it with more funding. Environmental leadership and economic prosperity do go hand in hand. We cannot address injustice without monitoring, but we can with energy. To improve the global environment and eradicate poverty as we know it, we should produce and export our energy and our clean air around the world. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Isaac. Next, I want to welcome, I believe remotely, Dana Johnson, currently serving as the Senior Director of Strategy and Federal Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. And welcome, Ms. Johnson. Please begin your statement at this time. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Caputo, and other members of
Let me just say it's Capito.
Capito.
Actually, it's confusing because we have a witness just before a committee, a nominee whose name is Caputo.
You're
And
confusing her even
yeah,
more.
I know. So you're not entirely wrong. Where are you today, Ms. Johnson? Where are you talking to us from?
I am talking to you from Washington, D.C.
Oh, welcome. This is a
And I
home,
am
a home
Chicago
game.
native.
Okay, good. Welcome aboard. Senator Capito and I are delighted to welcome you
Yes.
aboard.
My apologies, Senator Capito.
Not a problem. Don't worry about it.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you for convening this important dialogue on how we can improve the air quality in communities across this country for all Americans. As is noted, my name is Dana Johnson. I serve as Senior Director of Strategy and Federal Policy with We Act for Environmental Justice. We are a member-based organization whose mission is to build healthy communities by ensuring that people living in a community of color or low-income residents are able to participate meaningfully in decision-making at every level of government when it comes to environmental and public health policies and practices. We are based in Northern Manhattan and organized in New York City, New York State, and here in Washington, D.C. We are the only environmental justice organization that has a federal presence here, a federal policy office. And in this office, we convene the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum, which is a network of EJ groups representing 22 states, and there are about 50 members that make up that body. Americans living in communities of color have a racially disproportionate exposure to air pollution because of institutionalized bias in our environmental, energy, land use, and economic decision-making. Last year, researchers at the University of Illinois at Urbana in Champaign found that African Americans have a higher than average exposure to particulate matter from every pollution emitting source studied, including cars, trucks, power plants, construction, industrial operations, and agriculture. This outsized and dangerous exposure was repeated in nearly all categories when researchers grouped Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians into a people of color category and compared the risk pollution exposure to whites. Millions of Americans live, work, and play in conditions that can only be described as environmental emergencies. This was true in 1997 when our Northern Manhattan community housed 6 of the 8 bus depots in New York City. We had 1/3 of the city's bus fleet, which was diesel at the time, emitting pollution in our communities. And we did not have a single particulate matter air monitor present when, during the 8-hour period when particulate matter pollution was 4 times higher than it would be for annual levels set by the Environmental Protection Agency. We saw this again in 2005 in the Sauget community of St. Louis, which is an area of importance to Senator Duckworth, where there was a lack of air quality monitoring data available for an investigation into the health hazards associated with the operation of a waste incinerator. We saw it again in Chelsea, Massachusetts, where Congresswoman Presley and Senator Markey intervened to have an air quality monitor placed in that city when no air quality monitor was present before 2020. And that area of the community ranked third in the state for environmental hazards and had the highest asthma rates in the city. There are hundreds of cases like these across the country, and they tell us an important thing. Every facet of existence, including the health and economic conditions for those living in a front and fence line community, demands bold and decisive action to alleviate the cumulative burden of being exposed to carbon, ozone, nitrous oxide, particulate matter, methane, and sulfur dioxide. The proposed legislation for modernizing our air quality monitoring processes, our tools, our resources, staff, and technology that we are discussing today is that bold and decisive action that we need to begin to dramatically improve the quality of lives for all Americans. And I just want to flag 4 things really quickly from the bills that we think it's important to highlight. The community engagement and data gathering processes that are available really partner well with the principles of environmental justice that note that people have the right to participate in decision-making at every level of government. This includes needs assessment, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation. Communities have the right to know and be educated when it comes to pollution where they live, work, and play. For pollution present in their community, we have a right to know about the health risk associated with it and how it might exacerbate any present health conditions. And we have a right to corrective action. Once there is an awareness and understanding of air pollution in our communities, corrective action must be taken. Environmental justice principle number 6 demands that there be a cessation of the production of all toxins, hazardous waste, and radioactive materials, and that all present and current producers be held strictly accountable to the people for detoxifying and contaminants at the point of production. And we believe that these 3 bills being discussed today give us the opportunities to do that. And then I will just make quickly one final point around the investments. And I think it was noted that there has been a 20% decrease in funding for the EPA to do this important work. And we want to highlight the need to have the financial resources available to invest in the people, the technology, and the equipment necessary to really do quality monitoring in communities that have that have a legacy of harm as it relates to air pollution. Thank you.
Sounds, thank you so much for joining us today. And now batting cleanup. We're pleased to welcome Bart Eklund, currently serving as a senior technical expert at Haley and Aldrich. And welcome, Mr. Eklund. We invite you to proceed with your statement. Glad you could be with us. Thank you. Just make sure your mic's on. We want to hear every word.
Thank you.
There you go.
Technical expertise doesn't always apply to audiovisual aids. Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, distinguished senators, for the opportunity to speak today. You know, I concur with the statements that various folks have made about the success in improving air quality over my working lifetime. And some of the reasons for the success of the Clean Air Act for the NAAQS is that we have standards. We agree upon what we're trying to achieve for those 6 pollutants. And we have reference or equivalent methods so that when people gather data, they use agreed upon methods. And we don't argue about the data, we argue about what the implications might be. And when it comes to air toxics, we have some additional challenges. We do not have any national standards for air toxics, with the exception of lead. From jurisdiction to jurisdiction, there are differences in what's an acceptable level. So if I'm doing a study for dry cleaning fluid or arsenic or benzene, what concentrations we have to achieve in California may be different than Illinois, may be different than New York. And that, what concentration we have to achieve drives some of our choices on monitoring methodologies. And we don't have any standard methods for some of the air toxics. I know one of the bills calls out ethylene oxide. I developed a method for ethylene oxide 15 years ago. There's a couple other methods out there. There hasn't been methods development done to compare those different approaches to see how they compare and which, EPA doesn't necessarily endorse any of them at this point. And when we're looking for monitoring in communities for air toxics, we need to look at the timeframes of interest. Sometimes we're interested in very short-term exposures, such as during an accidental release or a process upset. Sometimes we're interested in lifetime exposure to low levels of carcinogens. And a mistake that's often made is trying to use one measurement method to address all those different objectives. And generally, we wind up needing to fine-tune our approach for the specific objective at hand. The trends in the monitoring community have been towards continuous monitoring, and sometimes that's needed, sometimes it's not, but we're generating huge amounts of data now. The other, I don't know if it's a trend, but there's a lot of enthusiasm for low-cost sensors, and there's very little enthusiasm among people like me that are experts in air monitoring for low-cost sensors. They have some pros and cons, obviously, but there's some deficiencies in their accuracy, precision, and sensitivity. And I know some of the bills have called out more use of low-cost sensors. I would suggest as an alternative, more short-term intensive studies. We've done that many times in the past when we're interested in understanding more about an issue to intensively study it for a shorter period of time with the kinds of equipment that we all have confidence in. And that's a potential trade-off. I would also point out that we're generating huge amounts of data, millions and millions and millions of data points a year for air quality. And unfortunately, I don't think there's really the funding for review and interpretation of that information. So for example, EPA has an urban air toxics monitoring program. They generate data across the US in urban areas for things like formaldehyde, mercury, benzene, many of the compounds we're interested in, but they ceased doing reporting of that in 2016. The data is still available, but it's no longer in a usable format for the public. They no longer can see a summary report. And so, there's a lot of reason to do more with the data we have, in addition to considering collecting more data. And then my final point is, in recent years, I do a lot of indoor air work, and people spend, the typical number you'll see is 89% of their time indoors. When we're doing indoor air studies, we collect outdoor air samples. But what people are exposed to in that 89% of the time they spend is overwhelmingly due to things consumer products and other things they have indoors. It's rarely outdoor air being a significant contributor to their overall exposure. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Senator Capito has to head out for another responsibility here in a second, but she's going to be asking her questions, and then we'll turn it over. I think I'll turn it over to next to Senator's White House is left now. We'll probably after her. I'll probably go right after her. So Senator Capito.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. Mr. Eklund, let me ask you if you can explain in really general terms, because I know you're a technical expert, the difference between monitors that are used to regulate criteria for air pollutants and then air toxics. Is there a difference there?
Certainly. So for criteria pollutants, they're largely the combustion products for things like vehicle use and burning coal. We're interested in short-term exposure, so we have monitors that give us time resolution of a few seconds or a few minutes. For air toxics, we're often interested in lifetime exposure because of the potential for them being cancer-causing. And in those cases, we don't need that same time resolution, but we need to get very, very sensitive results. So as a previous witness pointed out, we may be collecting a sample and shipping it off to a lab and getting the answer back in a matter of weeks rather than instantaneously.
So, we've heard testimony that there are gaps in some of these bills are aimed at trying to fill gaps. Would you describe, you mentioned enormous amounts of data that EPA is generating or collects, and then we're hearing all these gaps. I'm curious to know, why did EPA stop publishing the data in 2016 that we could, you could extrapolate for regular people like me to be able to see what's going on rather than to have to dig deep? And what gaps would you say there are in light of the testimony that you've heard before you?
I can't speak to EPA's.
You don't know?
I don't know.
Okay.
In terms of gaps, there are emerging pollutants, and the
What would be an example of an emerging pollutant?
well, PFAS is one, but also some of the things that were listed in Senator Duckworth's bill, ethylene oxide, formaldehyde.
Right.
And one of the issues is that the methods that we use to look at things around a refinery aren't good tools for those chemicals. And each of those chemicals presents some challenges from an analytical chemistry standpoint, and we wind up needing to spend a lot of money and effort to get data for one chemical at a time, as opposed to some of the existing methods that allow us to look at dozens or hundreds of chemicals with a single sample.
Okay. All right. Mr. Isaac, I want to ask you about the Permian Basin, because domestic air emissions, including ground-level ozone, have fallen significantly over the past few decades, meaning our country has much cleaner air. But that has not stopped this administration from moving forward with plans to redesignate your area, the Permian Basin, as being in non-containment with the ozone standards. How would a finding of non-attainment with the ozone standard impact what goes on in the Permian Basin, and how do you interpret their interpretation?
Well, and their interpretation is wrong. The EPA non-attainment areas should be based on vehicular traffic, and they're looking at remote areas where there is no vehicular traffic. And you're looking at one of the largest areas of production for oil and gas in this country. And so it would be absolutely catastrophic to put the EPA in non-attainment. And that's why our Governor Abbott, has come out full throttle against this and will work diligently to make sure that this is not implemented over the Permian Basin, whether it's Texas or New Mexico. But that energy that we are producing is really providing the fuel for this country and the rest of the world. And quite honestly, we need to be increasing production. We need to get the financial industry off of the backs of the oil and gas companies and the fossil fuel producers in this country. We need to get them to quit discriminating against responsible American energy producers. We need to get the government to get out of the way and get off the backs of these responsible energy producers, so that we can be helping people that are facing troubles in Sri Lanka and Germany and France and the Netherlands and Ghana and South Africa, that are just being crushed by energy poverty because they've adopted these policies to decarbonize their governments, their countries, which does nothing to improve the environment, but does everything to increase the cost of energy. So it's just another assault on the oil and gas industry.
Thank you. We've heard that, and we've stated, both of us, and you all have as well, that the mercury levels have come way down over the last 20 to 30 years. Consistent with everybody's testimony is that the reason that we have any issues with this, I wouldn't say any, but issues with this, is because of what goes on in China. So I'm curious to know, does China monitor their mercury emissions? Mr. Eklund, do you know?
No, I don't know, but I would be surprised if they do.
Yeah. Do you know?
I do know they have the pollution control technology, they just don't utilize it. And I have often said that there are, of all the technology the Chinese steal from us, it would be nice if they would utilize our pollution control technology. They don't. We're world leaders in clean air, and that impacts, as I said in our testimony, over 80% of the mercury deposits in the U.S. today come from foreign sources, and over half of that is from Asia.
Thank you.
Senator Capito, thanks very much to join us. I'll look forward to seeing you on the floor in a little bit. I'm going to ask unanimous consent for the record, submit for the record letters and statements of support for today's legislative hearing. These letters come from environmental organizations, environmental justice groups, public health advocates, including July 12th, 2022 letter from the American Lung Association in support of all three pieces of legislation we're examining today. I believe a vote has started, a series of votes have just started on the Senate floor, and we'll have to be out of here within less than 30 minutes. So I'm going to ask questions next, and I will yield to a Marine friend of mine. I'm a Navy guy. We're different uniforms, same team. And I'm going to yield to Senator Sullivan next, and Senator Whitehouse is back. He'll be following He'll follow Senator Sullivan. Okay, my questions, let me just start off with a quick statement. My colleagues have heard me say this more times than they want to remember, Mr. Isaacs, but there's an old saying that says, where you sit helps determine where you stand on a particular issue. I don't sit in Delaware, but I live in Delaware. I've lived there forever since I got out of the Navy a million years ago at the end of the Vietnam War. When I moved there, and my state is sinking. We're the lowest lying state in America. We're sinking. The seas around us are rising. Up and down the East Coast, you find similar kind of situations. A couple of our colleagues from Louisiana remind me from time to time, both Republicans, that in their state they lose about every 100 minutes of piece of land the size of a football field. And so during the course of this hearing, they're going to lose in Louisiana enough land for 2 football fields. It's going to go off into the sea. We have wildfires across the country, the big as my state. So there's stuff going on here. And there are reasons why we are still concerned about reducing carbon emissions, as you know. The challenge for us and the opportunity for us, going back to what Ms. Johnson said, just talking about the diesel bus emissions. One of the things that Senator Sullivan and I focus on is how do we clean up, do good things for our planet, for their air, water, and so forth, and create economic opportunity at the same time. And one of the things that, this is a committee that helped write the bipartisan infrastructure bill and reported out unanimously both the service transportation piece and all the water legislation. And we're proud of the work that we do. We also provide a lot of opportunity to address through electric vehicles, buses, reducing bus pollution, diesel emissions, and that sort of thing. There's a lot of opportunity for economic development and job creation as well. So we're focused on both sides of that. In terms of questions, I start with Ms. Fallon. Ms. Fallon, you still with us?
Yes, Senator, I needed to unmute.
Good. Mercury is a dangerous air toxic, as we know, that persists and bioaccumulates in the environment long after it's released, meaning it gets more dangerous over time. Unlike particulate matter and ozone pollution, mercury air pollution is more dangerous when it settles into our waterways and our food than when it's in the air. Yet we have significant data gaps knowing how much mercury is present in our environment at one time. For example, as you mentioned in your testimony, it's been a decade since EPA last compiled state mercury fish consumption advisories. My question, Ms. Fallon, is this: how is the mercury monitoring authorized in the Comprehensive National Mercury Monitoring Act different? How is it different from EPA's current air toxics monitoring programs? And why is this new type of mercury monitoring necessary to better protect health?
Thank you for that question. Currently, as you rightly said, mercury is not just an air pollution problem. And so while mercury levels, specifically mercury emissions, have gone down, The amount of mercury deposited to watersheds has not and may be increasing. And the funding is currently, to measure that deposition, being pieced together from state agencies, universities, nonprofit organizations. We don't have dedicated federal funding to measure mercury deposition. And we are down to 82 sites that measure mercury deposition. There have been about 90 others that were online at one point or another. And as the patterns of where mercury is coming from changes, it's particularly notable that we lack federal funding for measuring mercury deposition in Western states. So with the influx of mercury from emissions in China, it's really important that we are able to document mercury deposition in those Western states. And given the fishery in the Gulf states, it's equally important that we measure mercury deposition there. So we shouldn't take the fact that mercury emissions in the US are declining to mean that the mercury problem has been solved.
All right, thanks very much. Well, quick question and a quick answer. I'd ask from Ms. Johnson. You explained in your testimony how vulnerable populations like children, like seniors and pregnant women are more sensitive to the effects of air pollution, especially if they live in low-income communities or communities of color. Here's my question. Do you believe that the three pieces of legislation before us today complement one another to address the deficiencies of our current air monitoring systems and adequately protect vulnerable communities? Why should Congress, through these bills and other legislative action, continue to invest in air monitoring? I ask you to be succinct in responding to that question. Go ahead, Ms. Johnson.
Yes, thank you for your question, Chair Carper. I absolutely believe that the three pieces of legislation work well to address the issue of air pollution in our communities. I think that people living in an environmental justice community oftentimes notice the adverse health outcomes plaguing their community before data is available to validate that source. I think the burden of health protection has been placed on people living in communities, whether it's fundraising for monitors or performing community-based participatory research. And the passage of these bills, the Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act and the Public Health Air Quality Act, as well as the bill focused on mercury, can shift the burden of protecting communities, protecting the environment away from residents, and place that burden on our agencies and departments that have that responsibility. I think it also, as was mentioned earlier, can provide economic opportunities for individuals. We talked about the age of the monitors that we currently have in place and a need for us to do robust maintenance and care for them. And we believe that those are opportunities, economic opportunities that are available for individuals to be trained, to have jobs, as well as to have entrepreneurial opportunities in that space.
All right, that was good. Thanks. Thanks very much. Well, Senator Sullivan's next, followed by Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Padilla will be coming back after that. He'll be next. Okay, Senator Sullivan, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You too. Mr. Isaac, Mr. Eklund, I want to follow up on Mr. Isaac's discussions on the energy sector and the importance in terms of jobs, national security, economic security, prices at the pump. I couldn't agree with you more that this administration has undertaken a full assault on the sector. One thing, though, that never gets talked about, I'm from Alaska. I was the Commissioner of Natural Resources and Energy in Alaska. We have the highest environmental standards on production of any place in the world. In the world, by far. It's not even a close call. But that goes for America in general. I think Alaska is the highest. But can you just comment on that? Because a lot of people don't know that. So when we produce oil and gas in Texas and Alaska, New Mexico, by the way, New Mexico is just cranking. Deb Haaland, Martin Heinrich, their state, boy, do they crank on oil and gas. They get special treatment by the Biden administration. Almost half the federal permits issued by the Biden administration go to one state, Not Texas, not Alaska. They try to shut my state down every day. New Mexico. I think it'd be a great hearing to have. Why is New Mexico getting all this special treatment for oil and gas? Maybe it's the Secretary of Interior, maybe it's the senior senator, but who knows? I'm digressing here because an issue I get a little hot and bothered about. But do we have higher standards than, say, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iran, where the president's going around begging for more oil production? Do we? And shouldn't that matter?
Absolutely, Senator. The National Energy Technology Lab issued a report. You could take natural gas produced in this country, you explore it, you produce it, you pipe it, you liquefy it, and then you put it on a ship and you transport it around the world, and you can get that gas to Europe and to India with greater than 40% fewer life cycle emissions than getting the same gas just piped from Russia.
From Russia,
So
40%.
you're absolutely right. Yes,
Yeah. And
greater than
18 times, Venezuela's 18 times higher in terms of pollution, including air, than U.S. energy production. Isn't that true as well?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay.
And we're world leaders in environmental protection.
But that never gets out, when they come after the energy sector. Oh, you guys are horrible. We're the leader in the world, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
Let
We absolutely should.
Let me show you another chart that's really important. I bring this out a lot. By the way, all the national media's fact-checked this because they hate it, but it happens to be true, and even they have to admit it's true. So this is a chart of CO2 emissions since 2005, okay? That's the United States. We've reduced CO2 emissions by almost 15%, okay? There's China, there's India through the roof, okay? Why do you think that happened?
It's technology and it's environmental
Technology,
leadership.
and it's also the revolution in the production of natural gas in America, correct?
Yes.
Because it's clean burning relative to other sources. We moved off coal and we went to the production of natural gas.
I am glad you brought up CO2 because I'm ingesting higher concentrations than what's prevalent in the atmosphere, and I'm not spontaneously combusting.
Well-
So we can't demonize CO2. It's necessary for life on
But
Earth.
my point is, if other countries had the profile that we did, that we do, don't you think the global emissions problem we'd make significant, if China and India had our profile, wouldn't that be good for global emissions around the world?
Oh, absolutely.
Does everybody, Mr. Uckland, do you agree with that?
I think that's pretty obvious, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Ms. Fallon, do you agree with that?
Could you repeat your question, please?
So, well, let me
Oh,
get the one.
try
let me
to-
get the
try
one
to make it
final-
really
I'm-
short.
I'm going to be out of time here in a minute. I want to ask, Ms. Johnson, I want to ask one final question. It's a really important one for me, and I've brought this chart up a lot too. This is a chart about life expectancy in my state, in America. Dark blue, even purple, is the most life expectancy, increases from 1980 to 2014. Unfortunately, in America, there's a couple areas you look, orange, red, yellow, the life expectancy in America decreased. That's mostly the places where there's opioid challenges. Alaska's had the biggest life expectancy increases of any place in the country, almost 13 years. What's remarkable about this, and the reason it happened, is because resource development happened. That's the North Slope of Alaska, Northwest Arctic Borough, Aleutian Island chain with the Magnuson-Stevens Act. That's fisheries, that's oil, gas, mining. So my question is, this administration likes to talk a lot about environmental justice, environmental equity, but when it comes to Alaska Natives, they don't count. They don't count because they try to shut down resource development projects in these parts of my state that will not only hurt people, it's a matter of life and death. 13 years, life expectancy increase. So when people talk about environmental justice and environmental equity, Ms. Johnson, shouldn't they also include the Alaska Native people who are communities of color, who are often targeted by the Biden administration, not helped, and to promote policies that actually increase life expectancy?
Yeah, Ms. Johnson, I'm going to ask you to be succinct
Yep.
and respond to that question.
That's my
We have
question.
3 more folks to ask questions, and then we've got to go vote. All right, Ms. Johnson, very briefly, please. Thank you.
Yes, I will note that there are indigenous tribes in Alaska, and they are considered environmental justice communities. And so I would make the assumption that when one is talking about Native Alaskans, one could also be talking about an environmental justice community.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Whitehouse, please. Thanks for coming back, Sheldon.
Thanks. I love following Senator Sullivan because I get the chance to point out that his graph does not include methane and is based on coal to gas transition that has unleashed enormous amounts of excess methane. And it's not based on percentage, which is interesting because the U.S. has been the biggest carbon dioxide emitter. It's based on raw emissions. So yeah, we have bigger number because we're a bigger emitter, and I think that's what the fact-checking shows. Mr. Isaac, the Texas Public Policy Foundation has received funding from the fossil fuel billionaire Koch operation, from ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Devon Energy, and other fossil fuel companies. Is that correct?
If that's public knowledge, I don't keep track of who our donors are, but I know that we're supported by over close to 10,000 people across the United States that believe in liberty, free enterprise, and personal responsibility and support
Here's
our work.
what TPPF's former vice president said about the organization producing industry-friendly research and advocacy in exchange for donations from industries that would financially benefit from the industry-friendly policies. The fundraising involved approaching corporations, wealthy businessmen, and corporate-funded foundations with a pitch described as, and I quote, "We think this is beneficial to your industry, and would you consider providing us with a nonprofit contribution? Here's the timeline for the completion of the research. The parameters of the research are this. We expect it will result in some savings or outsourcing," end quote. I'd like to put this article from the Texas Observer into the record without objection.
Without objection.
Mr. Isaac, in 2020, the most recent year for which we have your TPPF 990 form, TPPF reported receiving over $17 million in donations, correct?
That's correct. It's my
How
understanding.
much of that
as well.
comes from entities connected to the fossil fuel industry?
I'm not advised.
You really don't know that that funding comes from the fossil fuel industry?
I could say it comes 100% from people that benefit from fossil fuels.
Yeah, I bet they do. I'm assuming that you're a fan of and familiar with the economist Milton Friedman, the godfather of conservative libertarianism.
Yes.
In fact, TPPF honored Dr. Friedman at a commemorative event for the important role he played in promoting economic freedom in the United States, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And are you aware that Dr. Friedman supported pricing of emissions, pollution pricing, indeed said it was the best way to deal with pollution, and he considered pollution to be a market failure. Is that correct?
I'm not advised of his comments on pollution pricing.
Is this being the one area where TPPF doesn't follow Friedman principles related to the fossil fuel donors of TPPF?
I would say that we're proud of our American achievement in having the cleanest air on record, and we're world leaders in environmental protection.
We meaning
The
TPPF?
foundation, actually, the foundation's absolutely proud of our country and the clean air that we have, the safest. We're number one when it comes to access to clean and safe drinking water. There's almost 1 billion people on the face of the earth that have no access to electricity.
Yeah,
would
we
love
keep trying to improve
export
that,
our
and
energy.
industry keeps trying to oppose us, and you work for the industry. You cite a Bloomberg article in your testimony saying that the average household will pay $5,200 more a year because of inflation, much of it from gas price hikes by big oil, which sets gas prices. At the same time, the International Monetary Fund estimates that damages associated with fossil fuel combustion to people's health, property, lives, amounted to approximately $640 billion in 2020, which works out per household to almost exactly $5,200. And that hits those households every year, not just when inflation surges, correct?
Yeah, I believe those are referring to statistical lives, and that's flawed data, much like the UN IPCC climate
You
model.
disagree with that?
Yes.
How much is the Ike Dike going to cost to protect the Texas coast from future hurricanes? Is it $31 billion?
I'm not sure the cost of the Ike Dike. The only levee that I'm aware of was built around Galveston
How much
Island.
is the Texas How much is the damage from Hurricane Harvey? Is it $125 billion?
I'm not advised.
Are 91% of families in the Houston area with flood insurance policies projected to see their rates go up due to increasing extreme weather events like Hurricane Harvey?
I would say it's due to extreme insurance companies that are no longer making funds available to the fossil fuel industry or the timber industry in this country, as well as financial institutions
How
that are
does making
discriminating.
funds available to the fossil fuel
You're limiting
industry
access
relate
to insurance policies.
prime?
and limiting
Hold on,
access to
hold on.
capital.
Hear my question. This is home insurance I'm talking about.
Yes.
You're talking about business insurance.
Correct.
Okay, just want to be clear about that. I'd like to put the record, into the record, the article about the increased cost to Houston families from flooding.
Yeah, without objection.
In other states, Florida, average homeowners insurance premiums up 55% in the last 3 years, due largely to increased hurricanes and flooding. California, more than 350,000 home and business owners saw property and casualty policies dropped because of more frequent and severe wildfires. Cargill's executive director has stated that climate change could reduce grain yields in the U.S. by 14% by mid-century and 42% by late century. What effect on prices would a 42% reduction in Midwestern grain yields have, Mr. Isaac?
I think the key word is there, it could. And what we're seeing is climate is absolutely changing and man is having an impact on it. But over the last 100 years, we've seen a
And a
reduction in
42%
death,
reduction in
98%.
supply would have an effect on price, would it not?
Could.
Thank you. My time is
Being the key
expired.
word. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much. And now we have Senator Kelly. Senator Kelly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to everybody who's testifying today. Mr. Eklund, I want to ask you about emission reduction credits and what flexibilities currently do or could exist under the Clean Air Act. So as you know, under the Clean Air Act, any new manufacturing or development must identify emission offsets through emission reduction credits. These credits are traditionally created by installing pollution controls at factories or at generation facilities. But in Arizona, where we do not have a legacy of heavy polluting industries, finding sources of emission reduction credits from traditional sources is challenging. This has led Maricopa County, the largest county in Arizona, to explore opportunities to create non-traditional credits from offsets from the transportation sector or improving efficiencies in refrigeration technologies. But they've encountered challenges working with EPA Region 9, given limitations of the Clean Air Act. So, Mr. Eklund, do you believe that there are opportunities in the Clean Air Act legislation that we're considering today or in other legislation to give EPA the additional ability to help localities create non-traditional emission reduction credits?
I'm not an expert in that topic, but I think we all would agree that EPA should have flexibility to reach goals that are agreed upon by non-traditional methods if necessary for those kind of situations like you described.
Yeah, so this is getting, rather challenging for Arizona. So if you could, after the hearing today, if there's any other information you can get on this topic and would work with my office, I'd appreciate that. Ms. Fallon, I think is testifying remotely. Ms. Fallon, thank you as well for being here today. Your testimony and that of several other of our witnesses have focused on the potential benefits that could come from the deployment of small, low-cost sensors to help localities monitor air quality at more locations and at a lower cost. Yet some have raised concerns that this technology has not been fully proven out, and in some cases, it creates false positives, which can push a community into noncompliance. Ms. Fallon, do you believe that the new small and low-cost sensors are able to perform at the same level or better than existing air quality management tools?
Thank you, Senator. That is a bit outside my specific area of expertise, so we can certainly get back to you with more details. But in general, innovations in air quality monitoring are pretty commonplace, and as new methods are adopted and new equipment is used over time, they're often co-located and coupled with the conventional methods for a period of time, so that through a pilot project, for example, we learn how to calibrate and better use new equipment. So innovation in air quality monitoring is important and should be funded so that we can continuously improve our measurement of air quality.
All right, I appreciate you getting back to us, because there has been a number of cases where this has created false positive situations. And Mr. Eklund, if you'd like to comment.
Right, so the low-cost sensors cannot be used for enforcement or compliance purposes because they don't have the capabilities to do that. So we can put them out for informational purposes, but when we have put them side by side with EPA reference or equivalent methods, they don't perform very well. And that's why I was making the case for alternative approaches like short-term intensive studies using more robust methods than relying on low-cost sensors as to gain that knowledge about how pollution might vary on the local scale.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of game-changing technology. We just need to make sure it's ready for widespread use. So thank you, Mr. Eklund, Ms. Fallon, and I yield back.
Senator Markey, have you already voted? I have not voted. Yeah, Senator Padilla, have you voted? Yeah. Would you mind if Senator Markey goes ahead and votes, speaks, asks his question? Are you able to do that? That would be helpful. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Senator Padilla.
Thank you.
Just a few years ago, Chelsea, Massachusetts, a major industrial hub with some of the highest rates of asthma in the United States, and the most elevated rates of lung disease, did not have any permanent air quality monitors, while nearby Boston had 3. And I'm proud that we were able to get some monitors deployed in Chelsea, but we have a lot more work to do to correct our patchwork approach to pollution measurements within affected communities. Ambient air quality monitors are critical tools to get baseline air quality measurements on a regional average. But we also need to understand that the air quality issues that can vary substantially from neighborhood to neighborhood are very real. Communities like Chelsea or Springfield or Lawrence deserve real-time data on a block-by-block basis in order to make day-to-day decisions about public health risks, as well as long-term decisions about siting infrastructure. Ms. Fallon, do you agree that hyperlocal monitors are helpful and provide additional data to regional ambient air monitors and will help us really to target the areas that need the most help?
Yes, Senator, I do agree with that. As you've mentioned, a lot of the existing monitoring provides regional average information, and we can have very strong gradients in air pollution exposure and air quality. And so we need to begin to better understand how people are affected who live close to these sources, such as people in Chelsea, and hyperlocal monitoring is the way to get there.
Yeah, thank you. Because the national average or the state average doesn't tell us anything about Chelsea, you know, and because you only get the average from the extremes, you know. So the suburbs, they're great, but you have to identify the Chelseas to know where the protections are in need of being placed, and we can't manage what we don't measure. We have to use the best available technology to make the best possible policy decisions. That's why I introduced the Technology Assessment for Air Quality Management Act, in addition to the Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act. This legislation would help the EPA annually update and expand its online air quality toolbox with the best available monitoring technology and connect the toolbox with environmental justice mapping and screening tools. It's 2022. We have new advanced technology that can fill critical hyper-local data gaps, but today's communities aren't reaping the benefits of today's monitors. We need to pass the Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act in order to provide EPA with the resources to kickstart hyperlocal monitoring programs in environmental justice communities across the nation. Ms. Johnson, do you agree that it's important that communities have access to air quality data that lets them know how healthy the air is in their neighborhood, especially for neighborhoods that have historically been redlined or afflicted with higher levels of pollution?
Yes, thank you for the question, Senator Markey, and your leadership on this issue. We do believe that it is important for communities to have this air quality data. We believe that they are already with citizen science projects identifying pollution in their communities, and this gives us an opportunity to match real-time data, real-time information with the lived experiences that people are having on the ground. I think it also helps to address, as you noted in your comments, how communities have been redlined and how we have centralized pollution. And while we may see improvements in air quality at a national level, this does give us the opportunity to really drill down and at a hyper-local level be able to quantify and qualify the experiences that people are having.
I thank you so much, and you also, I hope, believe that it's important to provide people on the front lines with jobs and training to work on community air monitoring issues. Do you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. As I noted earlier, this is an opportunity for us to train those who are underemployed or unemployed in a new skill set. It's an opportunity to give folks entrepreneurial possibilities in sort of managing and monitoring the upkeep of these systems and technologies. And so we do think it's a great opportunity, and WE ACT does have experience in training and developing people in these areas.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Johnson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to Senator Padilla for your
You
indulgence.
bet. Thanks for coming back. Senator Padilla, thank you for joining us again. Thank you.
Of course,
And for
thank
your,
you,
for your
Mr.
kind.
Chair. And I want to thank you for holding this hearing on bills to improve air quality monitoring. All three of the bills that we're talking about today will improve our air monitoring network, which is desperately needed to improve public health and access to clean air in our communities. Now, California, as everybody knows, is no stranger to polluted air. Going back to 1955, 15 years before the Clean Air Act and before the creation of California's own Air Resources Board, the city of Los Angeles, where I was born and raised, experienced the single smoggiest day in its history. And I know firsthand what that is like. When I was a kid growing up in Los Angeles, I remember the smog days when we were sent home from school early due to the devastating air quality. We've come a long way in improving air quality and clean air access for our communities, but California's clean air gains have not necessarily been equitable throughout the state. And I won't go into the entire history of redlining, but I think the results are devastatingly clear in many California communities. I'll just give an initial example. In the East Bay area in California, redline neighborhoods in Berkeley and Oakland, among others, were closer in proximity to polluting industries and further harmed by major highways that separated communities and increased exposure to pollution. Now, data shows that even today, people in those areas disproportionately suffer from higher levels of nitrogen dioxide pollution, which in turn increases rates of childhood asthma. A study from 2019 focused on 8 California cities found that residents of historically red-light neighborhoods were twice as likely to visit emergency rooms for asthma. So my first question is for Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson, how would the Environmental Justice Air Quality Monitoring Act help redlined neighborhoods, specifically like those in the East Bay, achieve the same air quality gains that non-redline communities have enjoyed?
Thank you for your question, Senator. I think that there are examples of hyperlocal air quality monitoring projects in California that give us an idea of the benefits that we can gain from these bills. One is a pollution monitoring project that was designed to increase youth literacy around air quality issues. But what it really found was that as it followed youth in their day-to-day activities, it found that their exposure at home and at school to transportation pollution was higher than expected because of the path that they needed to take to walk back and forth between those two places. And when we think about a project that the NRDC, the environmental group, and Google engaged in, it really showed that people living in a redlined community have a higher percentage of exposure to pollution that is 8 times that of any other area. And so I think our ability to really be able to capture this data will be the first step, or an additional step in the path that we need to be able to actually bring corrective action to these communities that will improve air quality.
Okay, thank you. And want to just piggyback on the question and the topic raised by Senator Markey about hyperlocal monitoring, which you just acknowledged once again. We've been working together with Senator Duckworth as well on an item. But I'll preface it with highlighting once again a tool developed in California known as Cal Enviro Screen that helps identify communities with the most significant pollution burden. Part of the innovation of Cal Enviro Screen is how it maps communities that are impacted by multiple sources of pollution, not just each source in isolation. It collects data on over 20 indicators to help California policymakers identify disadvantaged communities so we can better target climate investments. We're working, as I mentioned, with my colleagues as well as the Council on Environmental Quality to make recommendations for how to improve the federal climate and economic justice screening tool. And we hope that our recommendations, which are based on lessons learned from California, can be used to improve both the federal tools and states that have similar tools. So, Ms. Johnson, how is Cal EnviroScreen unique in its use of air quality data? And how would the legislation that we're focused on today help improve California's tool and the federal tools at CEQ and EPA?
Ms. Johnson, I'm going to ask you to answer that very briefly. Time's expired on the floor, but answer that very briefly, and then we'll ask you to answer it more completely for the record. Go ahead, Ms. Johnson.
Well, the Cal Enviro Screen is unique in that it uses satellite data and pairs that with other sensor technologies. The process for that tool had a robust community engagement complement to it. And when we think about the climate and economic justice screening tool married with other data sets, as noted in these pieces of legislation today, we do think that that community engagement, the use of satellite data and other data sets will really go a long way in ensuring that we are able to direct benefits to communities that have been most impacted by redlining and air pollution.
Good. I'm going to ask you to hold it at that. Again, Senator Patia, thanks so much for coming back. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for being with us. I want to thank Senator Capito. I want to thank the other colleagues who've joined us. We weren't sure if there was going to be much interest in this issue. It turns out there's more than I'd even expected, and I'm delighted with the kind of participation that we've had. I want to thank our staffs on both sides of the aisle for the work that they've done in this, and especially our witnesses. Our nation's air quality monitoring networks face some real challenges, but I think we have some opportunities within those challenges to address them through the legislative solutions we've talked about today, discussed today. Before we adjourn, a little bit of housekeeping. Senators will be allowed to submit written questions for the record through the close of business on Wednesday, July 27th, 2022. We will compile those questions, send them to our witnesses, and ask our witnesses to reply by August 10th, 2022. One of the questions I'm going to ask for the record is for the witnesses I want to have a diverse panel like this in issues that there's not a lot of unanimity. But one of the things I'll be asking you to do is like to maybe to come back and share with us, each of you, is one of the questions. What is, as maybe an area or two that we've talked about here today with respect to improving the quality of air monitoring, where do we agree? Not just where do we disagree, where do we agree? So I always look, that's what I always look for. All right, with that, I think, is it a wrap? Yep. With that, it's a wrap. Thank you all so much. Great to be with you. And this hearing is adjourned.